Chapter 1. Normalcy. I was baptized in my mother's blood. Some kids have a baptism ceremony with extended family grandparents, godparents, aunts, and uncles. They take pictures, share food, and make memories. There was no food at my baptism. No one took pictures, but the impact is lasting. I was 3 years old, and my mother came home in a hurry. My dad and I were the only ones there. The door slammed behind her. "I'm going to grab a few dollars," my mother said as she passed my father on the way back to the bedroom. "For what?" my father yelled, watching an episode of Sanford and Son on TV while I played with Ninja Turtles on the ground in front of him. "We want to get a bag for later," she responded down the hall. "My brother's going to pay us back later." His ears perked up, and he immediately got out of his seat. He threw the remote into the chair as he stomped back towards the bedroom. I was scared, but I got up and I followed him. I could hear him yelling at her down the hall, and when I got back there, standing by the open door, Mom had found Dad's wallet underneath a heap of dirty clothes. She was rifling through it, alternating between counting bills and trying to explain the situation to my dad. I could see my father's temper building. No one was going to smoke all of his money away. "The you are!" He ran over to her and reached for the money. I could see Mom was scared. She stared at him, her eyes wide open. She wasn't sure of what he would do. Dad grabbed her. They began to wrestle over the money. She tried holding the cash in her hands and between her legs, where he couldn't get it. He poked and prodded her to get the money. I ran over to them, scared for my mom. Between their wrestling, I could hear cars passing on the street through the open windows. Outside, the world went on, but inside, my world was being shaped, my mind molded. "Jim, what are you doing?" my mother asked helplessly. "You're not going to steal my money, not for some drugs for your loser brother," my dad shot back. Dad used to use drugs too, but after he quit it all, he was above it. Mom briefly escaped Dad's grasp. She tried to make a run for the door. This only angered him. He chased her down. After his attempts to pry the money from her hands failed, he slammed my mother against the wall, looked her square in the eye, and headbutted her. There was a loud crack. By this time, I was standing under my mom crying. She let out a guttural yelp as blood poured from her nose and onto me, her 3-year-old son. The money fell to the ground, covered in blood. I stood underneath her as she bawled. Her blood continued to spill. She consoled me, her nose clearly out of place. My father didn't comfort my mother, who cried as he walked away. He was a proud victor in that moment, getting what he wanted, proving the point he wanted to prove. He trash-talked her as she tried to clean up her mess. It was her mess. He made it so. "Clean that shit up. You're getting blood all over the fucking carpet. Look at your son. He's covered in your blood. Go get a fucking towel." Frantically, my mother tried to clean me up. She didn't realize she needed to stop her nose from bleeding first. She was in shock, trying to wipe up the blood with her bare hands as it pooled beneath us. I was wet with my mother's blood. It was in my eyes, on my face, and it stained my clothes. It smelled bad. Watching Dad hit Mom wasn't new to me, but it was still never easy to watch. At 3 years old, they were both my world. They were all I knew. In many ways, this was my coming of age, one of the very first and most intense memories I have. It was the birth of what would become my childhood. This was the baptism in the world of my dad. The way he treated, used, and abused people he claimed to love and care for was just a portion of his depravity. I had no idea that this wasn't normal, that it was a distorted example of what a father was. Men do not differ about what things they call evils. They differ enormously about what evils they call excusable. G.K. Chesterton. My mother tells the story this way. My aunt was shopping at the local Hinky Dinky, a popular grocery store chain in Omaha at the time. She ran back home to tell my mother about 2 handsome guys she met. One of them was a guy named Rick, and the other one was my future dad. My aunt and mother went back to the store and found my dad and Rick waiting like 2 cool dudes in a parked car, smoking cigarettes. Dad always thought he was the cool guy. My aunt and Rick started what was a hot and heavy but brief love affair that night. It ended unceremoniously with my aunt catching crabs and breaking up with him. My mother and father hit it off, and things progressed a bit slower than my aunt and Rick. Most relationships start off with a spark. The future is bright, and love's glow can be blinding. Same with my parents. My mother and dad weren't together for very long. They met in 1985, had me in early 1986, and my sister Brittany in 1987. Then they got married in November of 1989 and had my youngest sister in 1990. But by 1992, any reason either of them had for staying together was overcome by a poisonous desire to hurt each other. My father ran our trailer just like he ran his marriage, into the ground. I'd later come to find out that this was the blueprint for everything good in his life, to grab it, suck the life out of it, and to spit it out when it was ready to be discarded. I spent much of my childhood, before they divorced, watching my dad humiliate my mother. He called her names, picked on her for arbitrary things, and put her down in front of my sisters and me. Most of the time, it seemed like it was just out of sheer boredom. We were just tools in his game. "You're so fat, why don't you walk more?" he said to my mom. "Brandon, look at your mom's fat. Look how big that is. It's big like a hippo's, isn't it?" I was very young and wanted my dad's approval, so I agreed. "Yeah, Dad, it's like a hippo," I said. My dad laughed, seeing my mother was humiliated. "Why are you doing this?" she asked on the verge of tears. Then he told me, 4 years old at the time, to run full speed at my mother like a charging bull, head first, when she was turned the other way folding clothes. Seeking his acceptance and trusting his advice, I ran full bore and hit my head in the middle of her behind. Bang! My father laughed, enraging my mother. Her humiliation turned to anger, and she focused that rage at me, correcting her son for what he did wrong. She pushed me to the ground, and I started crying. My dad laughed louder. Of course, she couldn't correct my father. Dad also liked to put Mom down in front of other people, whether it was his parents or his friends. "You really are the stupidest person I know," he would say to her. "Use your f***ing brain, you dumb bitch." Verbally abusing my mother showcased his control, like it was a skill. He really enjoyed this skill. One time, the two of them decided to take Polaroid photos of each other naked. That wasn't too abnormal, intimate couples taking naked photos of each other, but my father took these photos of my mother, his wife, and he showed them to his friends. Those friends told her. As an adult, I imagine the shame she must have felt, seeing the man she loved embarrass her. My father reveled in his malevolence. He may have gained some sexual pleasure from using my mother's trust and seeing it turn to dust, but it went much deeper. He found joy in seeing others' pain, especially in those he claimed to love. I can't fathom doing any of this to someone I love, especially in front of my children. It deeply hurt my mother. It hurt her in the moment and for years to come. The same went for my sisters and me. Witnessing something like this at an early age, from someone who shapes and molds you, it has a deep impact. It took years to wade through the abuse and its after effects to separate who I was from what Dad did to me. My father reigned over my mother in all ways, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. My father didn't show affection to her with usual customs. He didn't dote on her or kiss her cheek or forehead. Instead, he'd demean her for being overweight. He'd put her down for wearing bad clothes or for the trailer being dirty. Sometimes he'd run up behind her and tug on her breasts, whistling in front of my sisters and me. In some twisted way, this was normal for him. This was capital. It became a game of hoping the abuse wouldn't happen to you, but also hoping not to watch your mother or sisters experience his abuse. After they divorced, it was almost a relief knowing he wouldn't hurt her anymore. I know now that when they split, it was the best thing that could have happened to her. She had a shot at a real life. He didn't get that memo and found new and inventive ways to hurt her, mostly through us. But now, instead of being bystanders to his abuse, we were pawns in his schemes. This became my normalcy.